Well, welcome to the third in our Food for Thought series. This one's called Let's Get Cooking. So tonight we're kind of going to make the punchline of a physicist and a psychologist walk into a kitchen. I'm not really sure what happens, but cool things are going to happen. And so we're going to try to integrate our work around sustainable food to try to learn all kinds of new things about the importance of cooking specifically. And so I'd like to thank again the RIEEE, or the Research Institute for Environment, Energy, and Economics, for their generous support of our evening. The refreshments in the back are thanks to them, as well as door prizes this time, so that's something new. If you're interested, we're giving out skillets, which are partially purchased by the RIEEE and partially purchased, donated by Mass General Store in town. And so put a name in there. And then I'd also like to thank the Office of Sustainability, because they're providing the funding for the videotaping this evening.
So, since this is the third in the series, we'd like to give you a little preview of the fourth in the series, and thankfully we have two people here representing from that group tonight. But for the fourth part of this series, we're going to have a mini film festival. Jess, is there anything that you want to add about that?
I've seen two of the three, and they're really, really interesting. Short, student-made documentaries, about 8 to 10 minutes each, all made by master students in the App Studies program here.
So you'll want to come back. Also, we have door prizes tonight. You may not have heard, but we have wonderful door prizes. Mass General Store donated a few very efficient skillets to use for your cooking endeavors. And then we also got a donation to be able to purchase children's cooking utensils, which I'm going to try to make the case is a good thing to get if you have kids who are into cooking.
So the commonality between our talk, I think, is this idea of taking back cooking, to sort of re-embrace home cooking. And it's a no-lose situation. There's so many potential benefits. For one, you get delicious meals and improved eating habits and better nutrition. So that leads to better health, certainly. It's a lot cheaper to eat at home than to rely on processed food and restaurants all the time. So there is a budget element there. Family connectedness. When we don't gather around a table, we lose a lot of cultural traditions and connectivity among each other, learning social skills and what have you. And then also realizing a sustainable food future. When we take back cooking, we take back control of our ingredients and the sourcing of those ingredients, which is really critical to a sustainable food future. And it's really super fun, which we'll hopefully make a case for tonight as well. So Amy's going to go ahead and take the first half.
Great. So what I'm going to try to do is just back up a little bit, back up from cooking, and give you an overview of kind of a developmental approach of looking at how children and adults learn to eat. And the reason I'm doing this is because I think I can fit in the work that I've been doing in this area and then try to marry it to the cooking part, because I don't really do cooking research per se, but again, a physicist and a psychologist meet up and we try to say, okay, where's the overlap here? So it's been really fun for me to try to figure out where's the overlap here with cooking, and I think I found it. So I'll share that with you in just a few minutes. So just to begin, I thought that we'd talk a little bit about, well, why is it that we want to study eating behavior? Well, when I first got into this, I wanted to do it just because I was interested in it. I was just fascinated about why it is that some people love some foods and other people love different foods. I tend to like all foods, so it's just puzzling if someone doesn't like food to me. I had a niece and nephew who were pretty picky eaters at the time, and they really inspired me to try to think about, well, how is it that we can avoid this if possible? Is it possible to avoid it, or is it just something that's innate that you can't really get out of? And so that led to point number 3 here, family well-being. My niece and nephew were very picky eaters, but their parents really had a frustration trying to get them to eat. And so another part of it was just thinking about how can you have fun, nutritious meals and sit around the table, and how can we promote that as a positive experience for everyone involved? And it was obvious to me at the time that parents were starting to get pretty stressed about this because they get so many messages about being the perfect parent with the perfect nutrition and that kind of thing. So is it possible? How is it possible to get kids to enjoy eating food? And then I was interested in the practical parts of child nutrition, and we know now a lot more now about how nutrition, even prenatal nutrition and infant nutrition, has long-term impacts on health over the lifespan. And then more recently, I've been interested in trying to connect my interest with eating behavior with my interest in sustainable living. And so for me, that comes through in the fact that I want people to eat food that is the most sustainably produced. Most of the time, that's food that hasn't been very processed. They're whole foods, fruits, vegetables, low processed foods. And sometimes those aren't the ones that we have a predisposition to want to eat. That's weird. Why would we not want to eat those kinds of foods? So I have questions about that. And then I'm also interested in the policy piece. In the end, you might ask, well, do we really need to study cooking or children's eating? And you know, there's a basic question of, yeah, that's interesting, but I think that the bigger issue here is that if we're going to change anything, that it's probably going to be at the policy level for a lot of issues. And so we need research. If our policymakers are data-driven, and that's an if they're data-driven, then we need research to be able to suggest particular policies. So I think that's pretty important too. So going back to the question of, you know, what is it that we're eating already, and what is it that we should eat, and what is it that we want to eat? If we look at dietary guidelines, you know, we're supposed to eat lots of fruits and vegetables, whole grains if possible, moderate sugar, that's turning into low sugar these days. Low fat is turning into higher fat these days. So all of these change over time, these recommendations. But the fruits and vegetables and grains part has been pretty standard throughout. And if we look at who's eating these, among our children in the United States, they're not really eating those at those recommended levels. Maybe 1% of kids are eating the recommendations in terms of the number of servings, the appropriate number of macronutrients and micronutrients. Very few are eating 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day, for instance. So why is that? Well, if we look at eating behavior, one of the classic questions in psychology is, well, to what extent are we the way we are because of our nature or genetics, biology, and to what extent are we the way we are because of nurturing, in other words, environmental influences on us. If we look at eating behavior, we can see that both of those are definitely the case, that we have the spectrum of things that influence our eating. And some of the biological influences are things like our innate preference for energy-dense foods that are higher in fats and higher in sweets and calories. And if you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense. In a hunter-gatherer society where food was scarce, those of us who ate and were attracted to high-caloric foods probably did better in that type of environment. But unfortunately, it doesn't work as well today when we're kind of flooded with eating opportunities and a vast variety of foods compared to in the past. Another predisposition that we have is that we tend to consume more if we're presented a variety of foods. So now we have much more variety, so that tends to increase intake. There's some other biological differences like bitter sensitivity. So there's a range of our sensitivity to foods like coffee or cruciferous vegetables is also considered bitter. So there are some changes that happen over time, like our salt sensitivity changes over time, our sour sensitivity changes over our lifespan. Children have a higher preference for sour foods than adults do, which makes sense if you look at sour candies that kids love, but maybe as an adult they're not that great. And then there are also temperamental differences, like are you a person that's open to trying new things or not? There are personality differences that might influence the way we eat. And then if we look at environmental influences, gosh, we can think of a whole bunch, right? We can generally say that parenting is an influence, and then I'm just going to take the easy way out here and say culture, which is huge. Culture is politics, economics, you know, we could go on and on and on. So there are a lot of different influences on our feeding. So what I want to do now is present a model, a way of looking at how we socialize children to eat certain ways. And I stole this model from researchers who developed it for developmental psychology. How is it that we socialize children? Grusek and Davidov published this article in 2013, I think. And I read it, and I immediately started thinking about how it applies so well to feeding. So I've stolen the model, and I'm going to show you how we could go through each of these domains of socialization and apply it to how we socialize about feeding in particular. So the first domain is called the protection domain. And this is one that we typically think of as being important during the infant years. So this has to do with innate needs, the innate need of an infant to be fed, or the innate need for a parent to respond to a crying infant. And so parenting behaviors in this domain have to do with how responsive they are with regard to their children's cues about their fullness and about their hunger. So outcomes in this would be, or examples would be, how is it that parents are responding to those hunger cues? And there's good evidence that shows that the more responsive parents are to an infant's hunger cues, the more likely that these children will turn into very self-regulated eaters. They'll know when they're full and when they're not full, and they won't kind of wait for someone else to tell them, oh, I'm full or not full. They learn their own internal cues of satiety. And then the second domain is the reciprocity domain. And in this domain, this is one that I personally love, if you can love a domain. With this domain, parents and children are on the same page. They both want the same things out of life. When it comes to feeding, they just both want to eat and have a good time, and all is well, right? So I like this one because it's so positive, and I think that research shows us a lot of ways about how to work and socialize children in this domain in ways that are pleasant for everyone. So some examples, a research study came out a few years ago showing that the types of snacks you give kids helps them get to dinner time without filling them up so much. So they gave kids lots of different snacks, and what they showed is that if you give cheese and fruits, for instance, instead of cheese and crackers, my daughter's watching me now, she's in on it. If you give that particular type of snack, it's very satisfying but not overfilling. Another example of setting things up would be, an example is a study that came out a few years ago that plays on our innate desire for variety. They gave kids in a preschool 3 different bowls of vegetables on some days, and in some days 3 different vegetables in each bowl. And on Sundays, they gave them the bowls with all the vegetables mixed. If all the vegetables are mixed in one bowl, the variety preference kicks in, and we eat more of that. There's something about just wanting to try something different. So we know that this is true for other kinds of food that maybe you wouldn't want to eat as much. But now the research is starting to turn around and say, how can we use some of these same psychological principles to help us eat foods that we do want to eat more of? And then another kind of classic finding in this research is the repeated exposure effect. We know that the more kids are exposed to a particular food, all of us, the more we're exposed to a food, in general, the more we're going to like it. It's a familiarity effect. And it's definitely true with kids. And researcher Leanne Birch at Penn State showed several years ago that sometimes it takes up to 15 tries for an infant to enjoy a food. Even though they didn't like it the first 14 times, they may like it. That's kind of a magic number on average. Some people take it too literally and make their kids go to 15. And then there's also a caveat, I think, that's really important for this research, and that's that you don't want to pressure kids to eat something 15 times. So there's a fine line between exposing and encouraging without making someone eat this 15 times, being very coercive about it. And coercion leads me to the next domain. This is the control domain. And this is one that doesn't feel very comfortable to me because it's basically trying to manipulate in some way in order to have parents and their children on the same page. Sometimes it is an effective strategy, but sometimes it leads to unintended consequences. Times that I feel it's important to use control, and by this I mean things like rewards, other types of extrinsic motivation, pressuring kids to eat. Rewards is one that's seen as positive, but it can backfire sometimes. One of the times that I think it's appropriate would be if a child has had a severe health issue. I read an article a few weeks ago about children who have feeding tubes because of health issues when they're just newborns, and they have a learned aversion to eating because they've had such a bad experience with feeding. So to them, their bodies are saying, no, that eating is going to hurt you. So they have a strong physical reaction to eating. In those cases, something like a reward system where you're trying to positively reinforce any kind of eating is appropriate. Sometimes, though, we use this a little bit too much. It's becoming part of everyday interactions. So we say, oh, you can't do this, you can't have dessert until you do this. You can't get up from the table until you do this. We have all of these games that we play to try to get kids to do what we want. And then the next domain is group participation. And this one's also fun for me because this is just modeling. What is it that your group does, and how does your group eat? So ways to expose children to cultural eating is just that they're in it, right? So this can have negative outcomes or positive outcomes depending on what your group is doing and what you may want your child to do in terms of eating. So you can imagine all of the cultural aspects of feeding that children pick up just because they're doing what people around them do. And then finally, I saved this one to last because this is what will get us to cooking. The last domain is the guided learning domain. So this is the domain where we may need to actively teach our children certain things about food. And some of the things that you may want to teach because maybe a child can't pick it up just from modeling would be things like having discussions about meal planning, going through the grocery store if you can. Sometimes that leads to conflict and control, taking a kid to the grocery store. But if you can, trying to negotiate that in a way that helps prepare for the feeding times, the meal times together. And then also cooking, I think. Cooking is something that we need to actually teach our children. They can pick some of that up from modeling, but there's some techniques that you need to explain. Why is it that you're doing certain things? So I haven't worked in this area related to cooking, so I did look to see, well, what kinds of research is out there? And there's not much. And I think, again, it's because people say, well, duh, yeah, cooking, you want to do that, it's fun. But I think that that's going to change. I think that we will see more research as we see the need to develop policies around cooking, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. So in one article that was a review article about barriers to cooking, they they had a focus group approach, and some of the things that parents said about barriers to cooking were surprising to me. So perceived time, they thought that it took on average 90 minutes instead of 30 minutes to go get some food and eat at the restaurant. But also perceived cost. So they thought that it was more expensive to eat at home than to go out to eat. Especially some of them mentioned trying to target restaurants that have free kids meals and things like that. Another thing that they mentioned that surprised me, but I totally get it, is an early school lunch. A lot of times schools, especially for younger kids, the children may be eating as early as 11 o'clock in the morning. And so they mentioned how, that happens to you, yeah. So by the afternoon, they talk about how kids come home and they're famished, and so they'll go and basically eat a meal in the afternoon, and then they'll go and participate in an activity, and then come back. Everybody's back home at 8 o'clock, and they said it's too late to cook at that point. So that's interesting to me. And so after school activities is covered there. And then picky eating, parents often say if we go out to eat, everybody can get what they want, so we don't have to worry about dealing with people who are unhappy, kids who are unhappy about what they're eating. And then also perceived food waste. So this wasn't waste in terms of what's left at the end of the meal, but what parents reported is that they didn't like it that they would go and buy something to make food, and then if they didn't get to it because something came up, then that food's wasted in the refrigerator if it goes bad before they cook it. And so I also looked at some other things about just cooking in general, and I found one study where they looked at families in Ireland, and they particularly focused on adults and asked them how much they cooked and when they learned to cook. And 60% of the people in this study said that mothers had taught them to cook when they were younger. And they divided the participants up, and they said, were you child learners? Did you learn to cook as a child? Did you learn to cook as a teenager? Or did you learn to cook as an adult? And what they found is that adults who said that they learned to cook as a child were then more confident, had a higher level of cooking skills, had more positive attitudes about cooking, and had higher diet quality. So you can imagine all of the things that would influence that. It's not just that you learn to cook as a child, but you can imagine other things that might be affecting that relationship as well. And then in another study, they looked at children who participated in an intervention where they had a lot of experience doing food prep, and by the end of this intervention, they reported a lot more self-efficacy related to cooking and their confidence in cooking. In another study, they found that video-assisted cooking was pretty useful. In other words, they had 4 different groups. They gave them cooking lessons in 4 different ways, so they could either just use a recipe and a video, and I think maybe the other one was someone showing them what to do. And the ones, they focus on the video part, but the ones who used the video reported that was very helpful. So regardless, all of the people who were watching the video in this case were able, they felt, to be able to translate that to their own cooking and thought that it was a positive experience. And then in another study where researchers reviewed the effectiveness of cooking classes all together, they found that cooking practice and classes as intervention does seem to be kind of promising. It looks like that would be helpful for people in general, but they weren't kind of getting on that bandwagon yet. They said that there's a lot of variability, that some results are showing that cookingness isn't that effective. Many of the studies were not long-term, they're very short-term. So in other words, a short-home message from this review article is that this area of research is definitely emerging. They're trying to figure out how to study it and how to study it well, and trying to figure out, well, what is it that we want to focus on, and trying to understand the implications for cooking and its importance for people. They reported that there wasn't enough, there was no take-home message in terms of best practices. We don't know yet what the magic cooking intervention is or how it should be used. I also wanted to give a few suggestions about age differences, age-appropriate cooking practices, and just to suggest that using a developmental perspective, there are different things, obviously, that you're going to want to do with different age kids. But you might be surprised what little bitty kids can do. Little kids, 2- and 3-year-olds, can do things and they love it. All they want to do is be like their mama and daddy. So they're really interested in trying things and doing whatever parents are doing in the house. So they're really good at tearing apart little mushrooms. They can mash potatoes if they're cooked well enough. They're good at picking parsley off of the parsley stems. They're really good at that. And then when we get to the 6- and 7-year-old period, there's kind of a big jump there in their abilities. And you see that I cheated in that 4- to 5-year-old range and said there's a lot of variability. So it's really kid-specific here, and you need to, parents would need to really know their child in order to know whether they're ready to advance to that next level of cooking. And then some other things I wanted to talk a little bit about are just some of the resources here locally and resources for parents in general who are interested in trying to expose their children to cooking more. So one question is, how much does this happen in public education in the area? This I don't know so much about. But this, I think, would be an appropriate place to ask, well, what are the policies of our school system here? There's a lot of regulation around USDA regulation, health department regulation that prevents cooking from happening in classrooms and that kind of thing. So I think at some point we'll want to look and see, well, are some of these things that have very good reasons behind them, is there a negative cost to that that may not be worth that particular regulation? So at some point I can see the conversation moving in that direction to try and figure out where do we need to be more flexible in the types of experiences we can give our children around cooking. I would also suggest, and in the article from Ireland, they were suggesting that maybe we need to have cooking be a more rigorous part of the curriculum again, like it used to be. It used to be that home ec was what people took if they wanted to learn cooking, but that was always an optional activity. So you either chose home ec or the arts, right? But maybe it should be something that is integrated into the curriculum. You can definitely learn math from cooking, right? So if you're creative, you can figure out how to integrate the two. Other sources of support, our local cooperative extension is a wonderful resource. Margie Mansher in particular, whose picture is there, is a great resource in our community. She really focuses on nutrition and healthy eating, but she's also very conscious of sustainable practices and is passionate about that. So when she cooks, she has this in mind. When she teaches cooking classes, she has this in mind. I wanted to put in a plug for her. She's teaching Pizza Adventure Week this summer, so a week-long camp for kids. They learn about all the different ingredients in the pizza throughout the week. They go and milk a cow one day. They pick blueberries another day, which I don't think they put on the pizza, but maybe that's for dessert. But they focus on different parts of the pizza every day. Another thing that Margie's doing in conjunction with the Playhouse is the Kids Can Cook series at the Playhouse. So this is for little bitty preschoolers. They have a weekly session on cooking. Another wonderful resource is Caldwell Community College. This summer they're offering baking camp, chocolates and candies, and pizza camp classes. I think you have to be 9 years old to take these classes, but this is a great resource in our area. Blue Ridge Women in Agriculture also provides a lot of resources in terms of the farm tour that they do and other types of support that they offer families related to local food. The farmers market and the farming organization are really good about having kids activities at the farmers market. getting kids to meet the farmers and to talk about them is a great experience, although I don't think there's any evidence to show that will improve their eating. I think common sense will tell you that those types of experiences with food are positive, and you'd expect that to be useful. And then finally, this isn't a local resource until you download it on your computer, but Chop Chop Magazine, Chop Chop Mag, is a great online resource. They produce a magazine that comes out like the Highlight magazines that come out, or Ricky, Ranger Rick, those types of kids magazines. They have one that's focused just on cooking, and they do a really nice job with it. And they have lots of recipes online too. So I think that I'll stop here, and I think Carla's going to go ahead and we're going to save questions until the end.
Yeah, that's super and really interesting. So I'm going to just take things in a little bit of a different direction, and I'm going to take the clicker. Yeah. And move in the direction of physics. I got to go in the right direction here. So Know What's Cooking is a class I teach on campus. It's also an outreach program I've started to try to open up a dialogue about the importance of cooking and how thermodynamics can help to inform good choices there. And it's also a website that I have started to try to have a place someone can go for more information. As a background, I think that I've found that food is an incredible platform that we can have a wide variety of discussions around. It's a starting point for a lot of discussions that are super important that we might be struggling with. When someone invites you over and they've lovingly prepared a meal and you're sitting around the table with them, it just opens up this amazing opportunity for open dialogue. It doesn't tend to be terribly a controversial place. And so I think we should embrace this opportunity to bring that back and have more community discussions around a table on a wide range of topics, because it's just tends to be a great environment. The conversation I've chosen to have around that table is about food, and it's a two-way situation. We know that our global food system contributes 30% of our greenhouse gases, and that's what's leading to climate change. So our food system is currently, incredibly suboptimal. For every calorie we consume, 10 calories of energy goes into the production of that calorie. This isn't something that we can continue. So our food system affects climate change, and I think we see the reverse as well. Climate change is now impacting our ability to produce food as well. And so when we look forward at trying to feed people with these drastically changing agricultural lines because of the additional heat forcing from greenhouse gases, we see some incredible opportunities here to open a dialogue. Just to make sure we're all on the same page on greenhouse gases, if we look at this, just the blue line to start out with, this shows, this is a combination of NASA data, NOAA data, and a lot of other research data that paleoclimatically has gone back to try to chart what carbon dioxide has looked like over a long period of time. So this goes back 800,000 years. We can ask the question, when did modern humans show up? And obviously that's being contested. But I think pretty safely, if we call it 100,000 years, we're safe. And so this goes back way before sort of modern human showed up. And we can see a lot of important things from this. For one, if we follow that the blue line, we see that there is a cyclic nature to atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration. There's a natural up and down. But we also see in the last 800,000 years, we haven't breached 300 parts per million. Today, we're over 400 parts per million. And no one in this room will ever see atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations under 400 in our lifetime. So clearly, we're in incredibly uncharted territory. The other important thing we can see here is the red line, which is global surface temperature, average global surface temperature. And what we see is a really striking correlation between atmospheric CO2 and the global surface temperature. And so we see there's definitely a dependency there that we can establish. I like to talk about climate change not in terms of doom and gloom, but rather in terms of empowerment. Like, we can do this. Most evidence shows that we're still within a window of opportunity, that we can change the course to affect the future, mainly for our kids and for our grandkids, to ensure that they have availability to food and fresh water that we did. And I believe this change is going to happen not from the government level down, clearly, but probably rather from small community conversations that gain momentum. And as that momentum continues to build, then we start to demand from the top that these changes take place. And so again, a great opportunity to start these conversations around a table of delicious, energy efficiently cooked food to try to start that movement forward. So that's really where I come at cooking, as sort of an opportunity to take back home cooking. I think we're losing a lot of our cultural traditions because we've relied on industrial food a bit too much. And I want to move away from sort of the drudgery of cooking. This is not vacuuming. This is not folding laundry. Right? This is cooking. It's crazy fun. I love it. It's my #1 hobby. My husband laughs at me that we get up from the lunch table. The first thing I do is walk over to the refrigerator to figure out what we're having for dinner. He's like, but we just ate lunch. Can we just be okay with that? But it's really fun for me to try to envision what is the next meal that I'm bringing about. So basically, who I am a physicist and a mechanical engineer. I'm passionate about climate change, and I'm Italian. And so you add all that into one human being, and out spits a physicist that does thermodynamic research on energy efficient cooking. And so I had a bunch of different things I could talk about. I chose to focus on this more recent work I've done on the thermodynamics of skillet material, which is super fun. Because for one, who knew that there were so many choices? This is not a stretch. All of these pans are readily available when you go try to shop for skillets. So it's a bit of a daunting decision. Also, the cool thing about skillets, as far as thermodynamics is concerned, is typically the skillet thermodynamics is more important than the food you're putting in it. There's more mass of skillet than mass of food, and so the skillet material is super important. Also, what we do in a skillet is usually short-term, high heat, and pretty temperature dependent. And so that control of temperature in a skillet is, it's a lot about transience, about heat up and cool down, and how we manage and how well can it retain heat when a cold slab of steak is placed on it. And so for a thermodynamicist, this offers all kinds of really cool research opportunity. I am just, I believe, at the beginning of the work that I can do in this area, but I just wanted to share with you where we've gone so far. So before we move forward, I have all these options here. If you were to imagine that you're moving into a tiny house, right? So show of hands, who spent like ridiculous hours on a couch watching tiny house YouTube videos, right? I mean, yeah, they're just crazy fun. I don't know why. I think it's probably a bit of a glimpse into the fact that we want to simplify, perhaps. But so say we're moving in a tiny house. You can't bring all your stuff from the kitchen. You got to choose one skillet in your kitchen, right? Somebody tell me, what would that cherished, awesome, fabulous skillet be? Does anybody have something they couldn't leave without? They'd have to have with them. Yes? Cast iron. Vintage or more recent?
Well, Amy's grandmother has an awesome one.
Yeah, see? Vintage. This is my man right there. Right, vintage cast iron. Really smooth. They don't finish them this way anymore. That's beautiful. So try to find them. They're really not easy to find, actually. Anybody else have something they would have to have with them in a tiny house? Deep dish Teflon, a non-stick. Definitely the choice of almost anybody. This is not deep dish, but I get where you're going, like a wok kind of thing, right? Yeah, so if you go to any mainstream cooking store, 90% of what you find is something non-stick-ish. I will be honest, I had it when I started this research, and they're no longer in my home now. So non-stick has left the building. But yeah, I mean, definitely the popular choice because of the nonstick quality. But we can actually achieve that without nonstick surfaces, which we'll talk about in a minute. So the question also came up because I had cast iron and I have stainless steel. And I know what happens when I haven't cooked with cast iron for a while and I put it on the burner. I burn stuff. It's one thing people don't like about cast iron. It burns everything. It burns everything because it needs so little energy. So if you put the burner at the same level you do for a stainless steel pot than a cast iron, it's going to burn. That's not bad news. That's great news because it means you can cook at a much lower energy level. But as a thermodynamicist, I knew the thermal properties of those materials, and it didn't make sense to me. Copper, for example, seemed like it should be the thing that needed less energy because its conductivity was so much better, and that wasn't the case. And so also that kind of piqued my curiosity to move in this, down this road of research. Okay, let's make sure we have terminology correct. When we're doing thermodynamics, one of the most important things is to talk about temperature. And a lot of us have, I think, lost of association of what we're really measuring when we measure temperature. Temperature is an indication of the motion energy of the molecules. So in a solid, when things are rigidly connected to each other, as you heat them up, they start to vibrate more and more, right? That means the pan is, so a cold pan versus a hot pan, the vibration of the molecules in the hot pan is going to be much more intense. That's for a solid. For a liquid and a gas, we can talk about vibration, rotation, and translation. These molecules are going hot air versus cold air. There's much more kinetic energy in the hot air. The other term is heat transfer, and a lot of times we use temperature and heat interchangeably. They mean dramatically different things. My husband and I met in thermodynamics class, right? So we are both thermodynamicists, makes us an extremely hot couple. Yeah, there was a spark from the very beginning. I can keep going, but I'll stop. Okay, first, so there's 3 modes of heat transfer, and he tells the students that if you always use the word heat with the word transfer, you won't get it wrong, because something doesn't have heat, but it has the ability to transfer that heat to some cooler object. And there's 3 ways we can accomplish that. The first is by conduction, which is the thermal transfer through a material without the movement of the material. This is what's happening in the base of a skillet, right? So we're actually moving heat through the bottom of that skillet. The second is by convection. So this is the thermal transfer of energy because the medium is moving. So we have natural convective currents that form inside a pan as you start to heat the water due to the differences in density that's set up there. We also can force convection if we turn a fan on. That's one other way to get that second mode of heat transfer. And then the third is called radiation, and this is the mode of heat transfer that does not require a medium. It's an electromagnetic wave that transfers thermal energy from the hotter object to the colder object. So when looking at skillets and trying to determine what is the most sustainable choice, there is a ridiculous list of things that we should consider. The heat transfer, that's the first 2. Convection is not a big factor with skillet selection, but definitely conduction and radiation. Heat capacity. Which of these are more thermally sluggish? So when you add heat, which will change temperature more rapidly and which will not? Which also says which material will hold heat better, will be more resilient to retain that temperature. Reactivity, this is a huge thing. What brings rise to thermal conductivity also often brings rise to reactivity with food. It's why we never cook on a copper pan without some kind of coating, because those free electrons love to grab onto our food, and then we impart a lot of metallic flavor to food. And so we have to be really cautious about how much our pan material is actually chemically altering our food. How capable is it for doing a wide range of burners? Induction, gas, resistance, what have you. Longevity, huge factor when we talk about sustainability. So, on the table here we have pans that will last 5 years, maybe 10 years if you're lucky, and pans that you will hand down to your grandchildren that'll last, will not end up in landfills, and it'll be that like cherished grandmother's cast iron that everybody's going to argue over when you're dead, basically. So a huge difference in longevity. Cost, I have a $200 solid copper versus a $15 cast iron. That's certainly something to consider. Non-stick properties, either by an applied coating or by a seasoning technique. How beautiful are they? I will just give it to you that this guy is rockin' beautiful, right? That's pretty much where my love with it ends, so I just like hang it on the wall and call it a piece of art, but don't use it. We'll get to that. And then lastly, maintenance. One of the reasons I hate copper. But how hard is it to keep, and how much cleaning do you need to do? Because we have a limited time, I'm only going to focus on that first one as far as my research was concerned, the conductivity piece, because it's the one that I couldn't really figure out what was going on. What I used for this research is what's called infrared thermography. And so what we know about an object's radiation is that if it's hot, it emits a short wave radiation, and if it's colder, it emits a wavelength that's much longer wavelength, so a longer distance from peak to peak of the electromagnetic wave coming off of the object. And so one way we can do this is what's just an infrared thermometer. This is like a required element for any foodie in the room. They cost $13. And so you instantly can get a surface reading of anything at 72.5. If you're heating up a pan and want to know if it's at the right sear temperature, it used to be pretty involved. You had to get a piece of water and see if it's skittered across the surface. Right now you can actually read a number and say we're 400 degrees, we're there. It's just fabulous. But for my research, I was interested in more than just a point. I wanted to see what was happening on the whole pan as it heated up. And so I gained access to an infrared camera, high temperature infrared camera. And so the great thing about this is that I'm going to take your picture and then I'm going to show you. So infrared camera allows us to see heat. So here's a great picture of all your lovely 98-degree bodies in the 70-degree room. And so we can see here that our eyes can only see a certain range, just the visible spectrum. But an infrared camera allows us to see things that are a longer wavelength than the longest wavelength our eyes can detect. So what this is doing is it picks up the wavelength that's emitted from the object and it converts it to a color. And so then you can see a picture there in the visible spectrum of me cooking at the stove, and then in the heat spectrum, the infrared spectrum, my 98-degree body definitely is a warmer color than the 70-degree room temperature around me, and then the pan, which is just heating up at 150 degrees or something, is much warmer than my body. So this gives us a great diagnostic tool to try to see what's happening thermodynamically. And so because we're focusing on conduction, I just wanted to say for a solid, typically the way conduction is achieved is what's called lattice vibration. And so you heat the bottom of the pan, those molecules begin to vibrate more rapidly. Because they're connected to the next row of molecules, they start to shake those molecules. And then the bottom ones get even hotter, and so we got more shaking. And so through lattice vibration, we move this thermal energy through the material through conduction. This shows the difference in thermal conductivity among these different pans. And what I wanted to highlight was that the orange bar right there is copper. This is aluminum, and way down here are our cast iron and carbon steel. And so we know that the ability, based on materials only, of the copper to transfer energy is incredibly efficient. We have a cast iron pan on the left side, an aluminum pan on the right side, and I tried to take pictures as this heated up every minute. Really every 10 seconds, and so I could kind of try to see this transient and try to understand better what was happening there. And so that was after 1 minute. I didn't see much difference. This is after 2 minutes. Still, I don't see an enormous difference, but we start to see a concentration of the thermal energy a little bit more within the box. So in this, I was only looking at the temperature in those little four triangles, those little four angles. And we can start to see a bit of a difference, again, cast iron on the left and aluminum on the right. And then we can even go to the 3-minute point, and here's where we see some pretty dramatic difference. So the cast iron, which is the poor conductor, actually has a much higher temperature concentration in the bottom, right, and not aluminum. So I still exactly know why that might be. So that's when it's really convenient to have not only a thermodynamicist as a husband, but also a material scientist. And so when there's two geeks in the house, what we do during dinner is that we break out thermal imaging images and say, what is going on with this? And so between our dialogue, we were able to see that what really is happening here is that if you look at the edge of the pan, the aluminum pan is hotter on the edge. And so not only is it effective conducting heat through the pan, but then it's also effective at spreading it out and sheeting it up. I don't really care about that. I don't need temperature on the edge because I'm not cooking on the edge. I'm only cooking on the bottom. So it ends up that the cast iron, because it is not a great conductor, concentrates the thermal energy in the bottom of the pan, which is where I need it. And so that started to then make sense. And if we look at this graph, I have that temperature, and this is again the maximum temperature of just the bottom of the pan over time. And we can see the cast iron hit this 450-degree goal just over 3 minutes, where it took the aluminum pan closer to 5 minutes, again, because it was sheeting that temperature outward. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Obviously, there's a huge range of options from nonstick to aluminum, copper, stainless all-clad, which has a layer sort of sandwiched in the stainless steel that is more conductive, and then cast iron and carbon steel. So if pressed to answer the question, what would I take with me to a tiny house if I were to go, it would certainly be something in the cast iron or carbon steel. It's pretty much all I have at home now. Personally, I've really grown to love carbon steel. It's something we don't use a ton in the United States. It's gaining popularity quite a bit. Pretty much the same thermal properties as cast iron, but because it has more iron, actually carbon steel has more iron than cast iron, it's more pliable, so it can be pressed into a shape, and so the surface is a lot smoother and it can be thinner. And so one of the biggest complaints of cast iron is its heft. It is not something you're going to flip an omelet out of. And so carbon steel is a little bit better because it is a little bit less weight, but you can still sort of build up a nice nonstick seasoning on it, and thermally it acts very similar. I also maybe recommend keeping one stainless pan on hand because of that reactivity issue. So if you're doing something that's high acidity, like a vinegar-based sauce or a tomato-based sauce, you don't want to cook in a cast iron because it will remove that nonstick surface, and it'll leach a lot of the iron out into your food, which to a certain extent is fine. We need some iron in our diet. But if it's a long time, something that's cooking for a long period of time, you either want a stainless, or the other option is an enameled cast iron, which is this one here, where they retain all the thermal properties of cast iron, but they put an enamel coating over it, and that's just to provide this barrier of reactivity between the cast iron and your food. The drawback of the enameled stuff is that you can never get it nonstick, right? It won't take on the sort of natural patina that makes it nonstick. So yeah, there's 6 pans for a good reason, because it's a really complicated answer. So in the end, I just, I again think that food is an incredible opportunity for us to open up a whole lot of dialogue. I love this quote by Marie Rodal that says, "Never underestimate the power of food to bring people together." And so hopefully this work can help to initiate some really important dialogue. And so I guess Amy and I are now just going to open the floor. I'm actually going to cook some pizza on a skillet while we're talking. So especially if you're a student and you don't want to heat up 30 pounds of steel when you cook a pizza, we can do it on a skillet and save an enormous amount of energy, and it happens like super fast. The key is to get a very hot skillet first, put the dough in there, let it cook for 1 minute, so let that surface of it cook. Flip it over, and then top it and lower the heat to medium. Put a lid on it, let the cheese melt, and you're done in about 5 minutes. So even faster than, I don't know, frozen pizza stuff. It is, yeah, so that if you really want it delicious, then I would stick the pan under the broiler for 1 minute and get that really nice Maillard reaction to occur also. But I will be doing this. I think I'm going to put some caramelized onions, because everything's better with caramelized onions. Black beans, I like adding vegetable protein to a lot of the stuff I do. People might think it's olives. but really it's black beans. A little bit of spinach maybe, and then cheese and a little bit of tomato sauce, and we're good to go. So I guess we'll start with questions. Stick this in here. Does anybody have questions? Go ahead.
So Carla, which one do you fry an egg in?
I fry an egg in a carbon steel pan. Yeah, in fact, I just made an omelet like 2 nights ago in this one here. And I've done it side by side to prove. I had a nonstick and I had a carbon steel, and I fried an egg in both of them, and I made an omelet actually in both of them, and they were equally nonstick. The nonstick deteriorates over time. And so when you get it out of the box, man, it is really hard to beat the nonstickness of a nonstick pan for the first 6 months. But all of them deteriorate. Even the newer pans that claim to be ceramic. Well, ceramic isn't nonstick, so they're ceramic, yes, and then chemically coated with something like a silicone to try to give it the nonstick piece. So there's all potential health problems with nonstick. I am not a chemist, but I just don't think you need it because you can get that same level of nonstickness in a cast iron or carbon steel. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, seasoning, right. So it seems so daunting. Oh, I got to season. But it's fabulous. So what I do is every time I cook, and stuff just falls off of it. There's very little cleanup. You can use soap. Soap's fine. Use dish soap and a sponge. And the main key to me is that you don't want to leave any texture. So you can see what this looks like, right? This looks like that. That's fine. When it was new, it looked like this. These are the same pan, just different colors, right? So you definitely want to build up this kind of funky color that tells you you're seasoning it. But that doesn't mean you want it to be crusty, and I think there's a misconception there. So with a cast iron or carbon steel, every time I use it, clean it. A little bit of soap is fine. Then I pop it back on the burner for 2 minutes, and I spray it down with some canola oil. So I just have like a canola sprayer. I wipe it with a paper towel, let those pores open again, absorb that, and then the next time you want to use it, it's ready to go. Probably doesn't need it every single time, especially if what you cooked had a high fat content, but I tend to that's the sort of my mode of operation, a little thin coat of oil and a little heat every time, and then it just is great every time. It's ready to go. So, yeah. Anybody?
I have a question for Ivana. So I was a picky eater, I still am kind of. But when I was a kid, I was a picky eater. I was the kind of kid that would sit by the window, during dinner and pick my food out the hole so my dog could eat it.
You're a smart picky eater.
Yeah. Or better yet, just put it on my sister's plate when she was too young to know it's But I found out later in life, just actually recently, that one of my problems is that I am a person who has an aversion to bitter.
Mm-hmm.
So I cannot eat cruciferous vegetables. I even have trouble smelling them because smelling them is kind of like tasting them. So I'm just wondering, when you're doing your research, how do you, if you're looking at what little kids are doing and they may not be able to verbalize, what's going on in their mouth or whatever, how do you tell whether or not a kid is sort of picky because of some sort of taste aversion that they have versus picky because of some of those domains that you mentioned?
That's a good question. So generally, the way people have been looking at picky eating is using a survey approach, where they either ask the parents or ask an adult what they were like retrospectively if they remembered into childhood. We also have some research that's more observational, where we're looking at what kids are willing to eat. Wait just a minute, please, okay? And so one of the things that in looking at picky eating that's gotten more sophisticated in just the past few years is that instead of just asking maybe 4 questions about were you a picky eater and just kind of broadly defined, we actually just developed a measure for adults, and we want to transfer it to a kid measure, but in adults we have 5 different domains of picky eating. So now we have questions about, is it more of a taste aversion, or is it just that you don't like food in general? So we're trying to really pinpoint what it is about the picky eating, and just instead of having a catch-all category. And so some of the things, like what you talked about with bitter sensitivity, wait just a minute, babe. Some other things that influence kids learning about foods early on is early health. I mentioned earlier that some kids that maybe had a feeding tube could have a strong aversion. Other types of things that you may not know about, and I think it's interesting because a lot of people who are picky eaters don't know where it came from, and it's because this infant period and toddler period we don't remember. So you could have had an allergy to food when you were young and grew out of it, but you had an aversion for a while. And then when you combine that, some kind of issue with feeding, with whatever your parents are doing to try to counteract that problem, if they think it's a problem, then that also adds a lot of variability in terms of what you're going to be like as an eater.
You put the top on.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Grace, did you have a question? Yeah.
So is there research, have you seen any research on eating behavior in adults if they grew up cooking? Is there a clear connection that's been shown between if you grew up cooking with your parents, then you do or do not develop a food behavior?
I'm going to write that one down. That's good. No. Yeah, I don't know of any research that's linked early cooking, so we'd have to ask retrospectively about cooking and how that influences feeding. I mean, we generally know that picky eaters tend to eat more processed foods, right, because that's what's going to be more palatable. But I don't know of the connection with cooking. It's a great question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other ideas, research ideas?
Yeah, I know.
Open. Uh-huh.
I just have another question too. So I was, as you guys were both talking, I was thinking about this conversation that I had with Grace when we were reminiscing about growing up having gardens.
Mm-hmm.
And my family had 6 kids, so my parents had this huge garden
Well, yeah.
where,
Yeah.
you know, it was basically like cat food, kind of, you know, we needed to have the garden. And I think about my dad who grew up, he had to basically hunt and garden in order to eat. And those things have kind of fallen away, as Carl was saying, we're losing a lot of skills related to cooking, but also the kind of skills related to providing food for ourselves that we then cook or eat or cook and eat. And also share, because I think about how when we harvested food, we would take it to the neighbors. When they harvested food, they would bring it to us and whatever. But do you know anything about sort of this relationship between growing your own food, raising your own food, and how that goes from, you know, a personal farm to the table, and how people eat, or whether, I don't necessarily mean picky eating, but
Mm-hmm.
how people eat.
Yeah, no, I don't know anything about that either. You know, that's the question that people are wondering with school gardens and the efficacy of school gardens. They're a great idea, but are they worth putting our, you know, small resources and financial resources into? And so more work is starting to develop in that area, but I don't know of any research that looks at gardening at home, self-provisioning, and how that affects eating behavior.
But that's a great research project.
Yeah, for you and me.
All three of us.
But another thing just to think about that reminded me of in the study that I mentioned where the adult cookers reported that they learned from their mothers. You can imagine how much of a change we're going to have if mothers aren't cooking anymore, or if people in the house aren't cooking. If mothers aren't cooking and they were learning it from mothers, that's why I think that we may need, in order to get back into it, to think of other methods of learning, like in public schools or through videos. If that's an effective kind of intervention, we may need to be creative. It's not as warm and cuddly as a mom, but we may have to have other types of ways for people to learn now that's different from the past. Yeah.
Going off what you said, there's actually a really good TED Talk. It's actually really it is about a guy that started a gardening initiative in Los Angeles, and he went around the whole city of Los Angeles, developing gardens in the local communities in the inner city and teaching kids how to garden. And they really did discover that if you teach kids to grow tomatoes, they eat tomatoes. And that's kind of like his motto. The more and more you teach them how to garden and the process that you go through, that it really did influence things. And he's created this big movement in the LA area, inner city kids that aren't typically exposed to gardens. And he grew up around gardening, so he wanted to do that. So he calls himself the gangster gardener. So it's a pretty neat TED Talk.
And some of the basic research on children's eating would predict that that exposure effect. If you're exposed to food without too much pressure, it seems that you're going to be more likely to eat it. And then there's also been some research that shows that even more effective than being exposed visually is to taste it. That tasting is more effective than just looking at a fruit or a vegetable. And that's the kind of tricky part. How do you get kids to taste food without stuffing it in their mouth?
One of our cast iron questions.
Yeah.
The restaurant chefs tend to just obsess over their cast iron.
Okay.
I worked for a chef once that would not let us wash the cast iron ever.
Yeah,
Like,
okay.
he would just lose his mind if he caught anybody washing it. So
Wash as in water even, or like
no,
soap?
that's only wiping out with
Gotcha.
paper towels. No
Incredibly easy.
water.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So is there any scientific information to back that idea up, or is it okay to wash cast
I
iron?
am not a commercial chef. And so I'm afraid, but no, I mean, I think I've read enough to say, I mean, it's pretty fine to use. That's a polymerized layer. So you've actually chemically converted that oil to this hardened layer and a slight sort of, I don't have a microphone, thank you. A little bit of water definitely doesn't affect it. So, I mean, I've done it to all these, and still, the next time I use them, I can fry an egg without any problem. So, but I'm not gonna. What's
Sorry, you could have stopped at polymerized layer.
It's a polymerized layer, you see. So.
Reuse cast iron an infinite number of times?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it just gets better with time, which is, one recommendation I have is don't buy 80 million of them. They come in every shape and size and whatever, because the more you use them, if it's this pan that I use day in and day out all the time, it's perfect because it gets that kind of use. The oil doesn't go rancid. It's just the more use, the better, period. And so same with this carbon steel is one I use a whole bunch, and so it's always just seasoned and ready to go. I have a cast iron for an oven also, which is also pretty great because you can put it under a broiler, and so it can get super hot, and then till you put oven fries in it, you've already got the bottom heated and ready, and then you can just bake it for the rest of the way, but you've sort of gotten half the way there just by the pan itself. So
You only season with vegetable oil?
I use canola. Canola, no, I don't think olive oil smoke point is really varied across if it's virgin olive oil, first press or not. There's a lot of variation in the smoke point. I think what I've learned is that canola is more consistent, and so you can buy, like Lodge makes cast iron seasoning, but if you look at the ingredients, it's canola oil. So it seems easier to me to just buy one of these misters and fill it with canola oil, and it works. I think flaxseed is the other one that's recommended really highly that does a really nice job of building up that polymerized layer. So, but I mean, we've had breakdown issues too if I get into Mama's tomato sauce and don't think about it. If it's a short cook, I made sauce just the other day. It was, 15 minutes or 20 minutes in the pan, no problem. But if I leave it there accidentally, it's something highly acidic. No big deal though. You just re-season it and you're off and running again. A lot of the Lodge pans now, in fact, even the ones we have for door prizes, come pre-seasoned. So that initial season is done. So then you just start cooking and you just top it off every time and you're good to go. You get away from that first season, but even that's really just not that big of a deal. Okay, so our next session will be May 7th. We'll have a small documentary film. It'll be in the thank you for being here.